Hello and welcome to Gin with Gwynne. I'm Oliver Gwynne, and this is where I give you my off-the-cuff and unrehearsed thoughts on marketing data and philosophy. This week, why you can't talk to your BI tool. So I've had quite a lot of people recently asking me about NLP, natural language processing for data querying. So the idea would be that you would ask a question in your own voice and that you would get back an answer, whether that be a text answer, whether that be a chart, whether that be a series of graphs, whatever that might be. And unfortunately, to save you a video, today it doesn't work. You can stop watching now. It doesn't work today. I've tried it a number of times. So I've tried it 3 different plugins that work with Metabase. I've tried 2 different plugins that work with Power BI. On projects, we've also been trying this Stripe one. Now, financial data is normally pretty well structured, but the Stripe has this AI thing that you can use to ask questions, and it doesn't work if you ask it anything even slightly more advanced. And so, as of today, a lot of the tools that I've tried, they just don't work, because if I try asking it the same question in a couple of different ways, it gives me different results, which is not what you want. So I thought in this video, I'd just go through in detail what actually would happen in the process that you ask a question to getting a result, what the long-term negative impacts of that is, and what you need to think about as you go forward. That's what we're going to do today. So first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about what actually happens when you type in this natural language query. The example I'm going to give is I'm going to pick something with a few layers in it. So what were the best selling products last quarter for Gen Z customers is my question. Cool. So the first thing that happens is intent parsing and semantic disambiguation. That's nice and easy to say. What does that actually mean? It means that the system, the LLM that you've developed, has to interpret what is my intent. Are they asking about revenue, units sold, margin? What does Gen Z mean? Is it birth years? Is it the age today? Is it a segment ID? And so the LLM has to put in place some sort of rules and parser to try and map fuzzy language to known structures within your data warehouse that you've got. Now, there is an argument in the data world that the future of data is not having to organize your data and spend a lot of time modeling it and having all the concepts, that actually it's raw data that you could just query really well, but that doesn't really work, and we'll go into the reasons why. So instantly we have a few problems here. So each of the elements in my question has to be figured out what it relates to. So that relates to what's a best selling product? What is a product? What is last quarter compared to where I am today? What is a Gen Z customer? And all of these things quite possibly haven't been defined in your back end. And so straight away, you've got a lot of ambiguity, you've got nested clauses, you've got subjective terms. LLMs, they hallucinate mappings when the schema isn't known or precise. So unless you've gone through and said, this is what Gen Z is, this is what a product is, unless you've taken the time to do the heavy lifting on having a data dictionary, having tables mapped out, having your core concepts mapped in a star scheme, it's going to start making stuff up. And that's not good. The process of creating any data, of running a SQL query, costs money. And I feel like people don't really know this. Maybe you do at some level. When you ask ChatGPT a question, it costs money for OpenAI. It costs money to run queries. Every single time you run a query, it costs money. Now, that might only be a few pence, but it can actually add up quite a lot of, quite a lot. So just bear in mind throughout this that everything that you run costs money. That is the reason why most dashboards, if you're looking at something and it's a daily piece of information that you need, it will run once overnight when you're asleep, and then you'll have fresh data in the morning. That's a lot more cost effective. The more frequently that you need that data, the more expensive it is to query. So that's the reason that real time is a key consideration when you're mapping out your data. Do you really need to know every second if that data is updated? Because if not, it's costing you money. How much money you might be asking? So yeah, in some cases it might be like 1 pence. In other cases, if it's a really complicated query that takes into account a lot of different factors like monthly recurring revenue might be one, that could be quite high. It could be like 10, £20. We had one client who was doing MMR and it cost £12 to run that query. And so if you're doing that 4 or 5 times a day, that's going to start adding up if multiple people do it in your organization. So really important to bear in mind that every query that you run costs money. And with an LMM where things are a bit fuzzy and maybe it gets things wrong, you're much more likely to run that query 4 or 5 times instead of 1 time that you would run it if you had structured data. And so that will start to cost money. So after it's done its intent parsing and trying to figure out what you actually want, it then does schema mapping. So what does that actually mean? It means that it translates these parsed terms into database fields, tables, and relationships. So in our example, best selling could be sum, order items quantity. Last quarter could be order date between start and end. Gen Z could be age between 18 and 25, or segment ID equals Gen Z. So it uses metadata, column names, data dictionaries, embeddings, or fine-tuned models trained on prior queries to figure out, this is your question, where does that actually relate to in my data warehouse? And that's why I was saying it's really important, if you're thinking about this or if you're on the road to wanting to enable AI, you need to do the hard, horrible, time-consuming work of figuring out, what does everything mean to me? When I do EBITDA, how do I calculate that? When I say a customer, what exactly is a customer? If I have a physical product and a subscription that goes with it, is somebody a customer when they buy the product, or are they a user when they use the app? These definitions are really, really important to data in general, but they're going to get more and more important as we enter this sort of AI world. So the cost here, you've already had a cost because you've run a query to figure out what exactly are you talking about. The problem here is that it requires an indexing of all of your tables typically to figure out what you need. So you're sort of boiling the ocean for a drop of water. And that is going to cost you money because it's querying your entire database in a lot of cases, even where you've got things neatly positioned. Hopefully the parsing will narrow that down a bit, but even so, you might have a few different concepts that are quite close, and the LMM has to figure that out. And so it's going through a lot of information, and that's going to cost you money. Much more money than just running a query if you've already got it structured. The next thing is SQL generation, or as I like to call it, squirrel. I'm the only one who does that. I'm just cute like that. What does that actually do? So it constructs an SQL query. What is that? It's like a Excel macro on speed. It's like a complicated, you take this bit of data, you take this bit of data, you add it up, and you get this particular piece of maths. So that's basically what an SQL query is. It's a piece of code that combines, overlaps, and adds your logic to data. And typically for an LLM, this will be template based, so it will be used with some sort of logic checking. It will be based on how you're modeling things in the past, and it will go through your query and it will start to say, okay, I'm looking for all of the records that match the date that we've given, and I want to know the best products, and I need to know for this particular kind of user. The challenges here is that typically there's quite a big gap, to be honest, with code. I've seen some really terrible code in my time from people who are quite decent data analysts and stuff. They're typically standalone people, but there's a big gap in code. Bad code exists, and it will cost you more money. Again, coming back to the fact that queries cost money, bad code will cost you more money. And LLMs don't have the knowledge of a person who's been doing it for years. They can only really go on examples that you feed it and that have been fed into it. And so it's much more likely that mistakes will happen. So you might have joins in there that are incorrect or missing. You're going to have edge cases in your filters. So like fiscal versus calendar quarters. And in terms of cost, there's an inference cost, so an LLM token usage. There's post-generation validation, which we'll come on to, and debugging. And there's a high engineering oversight needed if those answers are critical. If it's a quick answer, maybe you could get away with that if it's quite a simple question. But overall, you probably need somebody to validate those numbers as well. And so, SQL query, I'm sure we've all used ChatGPT or Grok or something to generate SQL, and often it works. I've used it and it's worked. But it's not necessarily good code. It's not code that's going to scale with you. It's not code that's going to be cheap if you start adding more data in there. Um, and that's important. It's really important as you want to scale analytics and as your queries. If everybody in the organization is using a LLM to ask questions, then that's going to get really expensive, basically. What happens then? So you've got your SQL query, and now there needs to be some sort of query validation and execution. So you run it runs the query on a real time or a warehouse database. So it's basically checking for syntax errors, permissions, row limits, compute limits. This needs to happen on your training instance. It needs to happen on your interim steps. Basically, it shouldn't happen on a live production database because that's going to cost you money, basically. And here it's basically seeing if the query it's written will run. Poorly written queries may hit large scans, as I was talking earlier, or expensive joins. And high concurrency with ad hoc queries strains compute clusters. So, as I say, every time you run a query, a database is doing some maths in the background, and so you're potentially going through a lot of data to get a very simple answer, and that can start to add up. That could be £5 or even more per query. And misfires from LLM generated SQL can lead to surprise bills where it's scanned multiple things just for simple metrics. But hopefully, it gives you something that works. Hopefully. And then post processing, formatting, visualization. So formats raw results into user friendly tables, charts, or dashboards. The challenges here are that you often have mismatches between expected and actual input, and that can happen with people, but it will happen a lot more with LLMs at this stage of maturity with them. They might return the wrong chart types or label them incorrectly. It's not a high cost here, but it adds design or UX and QA burden. So throughout this process, you have incurred a cost, and that's really important to know. I want to go over the pros versus the cons here a little bit because I've talked about it quite negatively, but there is some good things. So the problem in data today is that it takes a lot of time because a human needs to figure out what you mean and they have to translate that. Then they have to go write that code, validate that code, and give it back to you. And so while a one off SQL code might only take an hour or something really, really quickly, for more complicated things, it might take more time. And if you're inputting a completely new data source and you've got a long list of metrics, it can take weeks and months. And so your time to value from data is longer. And that's why a lot of people are very confidently saying that AI will be the death of the data industry. And the idea of somebody not needing to know SQL or code and just ask questions and get them back very quickly is really good. But as I said, the answer might not be right. And then that's going to really give you a lack of trust in the numbers. And so it's not really self-serve because the illusion of asking anything today is going to break really quickly under business logic, under the fact that Jim says one thing and Pam says another, and it needs a lot of hand holding in that entire situation. There's a hidden ops step that people won't realize when they're just querying things because they're just so used to asking like ChatGPT anything all the time. And so they won't really realize that, hey, this is costing you maybe £1 every single time. And if there's 1,000 employees doing this multiple times a day, suddenly that's going to really add up. And the value from that data is not necessarily concurrent. And there's also security and governance risks. So LLMs can expose sensitive data fields like customer personal information if not tightly scoped. Regulatory compliance becomes harder to enforce in natural language inference. And so the reason that you can't really ask NLP today to give you some SQL code is just that human queries are imprecise, they're layered, they're often full of assumptions. Data is black and white. It demands rigid structure, schema awareness, and domain rules. The translation between the two is expensive, it's brittle, it's not autonomous necessarily. And until we solve schema grounding, ambiguity, and real time governance, NLP for data remains powerful but very risky tool, certainly not a silver bullet today. And so, if you are thinking about AI and AI products, which a lot of people are, and you've not even got a data warehouse, then forget about it. You ain't going to get anywhere near that today. You have to do the horrible groundwork, which is data dictionaries, defining your data, putting it in tables that make sense, using your star schema logic to map out in a way that will scale really nicely. And that's going to take you maybe 6 months if you get somebody to do it internally, or a lot less time if you want to hire an agency like 173 Tech. But even then, today, I would still not recommend NLP for BI. I hope that explains well the reasons why I don't think it's suitable today. I think that that will change because I think more and more companies are going through that painful process of defining their data. And most people, once you've mapped out the core concepts, once that's done, it's sort of an upfront cost, but it's going to last a long time in the future until your business changes quite substantially. And so it's an upfront cost, but it's going to have a long payoff in terms of data. I hope I've explained that well. Any questions, put them in the comments. And thanks very much for watching another Gin with Gwynne.